Hello everyone, how's it going? Welcome to Crack a Pack a Day. Every day, I'm going to open a booster pack of Magic the Gathering cards and evaluate the contents, choosing one of them to take, as if I were taking part in a draft and this was pack one, pick one. After yesterday's Throwback Thursday, we're back to opening a pack of Battle for Zendikar. Let's open it up and take a look. Up first is Call of the Scions, a sorcery for 2 and a green. It has Devoid, and you put 2 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature tokens onto the battlefield. They have Sacrifice this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. Essentially, this spell can be viewed as a 2/2 creature for 3 with some upsides. Those being that it's split across 2 bodies, and that either or both can sacrifice themselves for mana. Whilst you wouldn't particularly fancy playing a vanilla 2/2 for 3, I think the extras more than make up for the stats. In addition to adding 2 bodies to the board, the Scions can be used to ramp you. It's not unreasonable to cast this on turn 3, then cast a 6-drop on turn 4. And if you're behind, then it'll give you multiple blockers. Overall, I think this is a pretty solid card that does well almost any time you draw and cast it. If today's pack turns out to be pretty weak, then I can see myself maybe picking this first. Merc Strider is a 3/2 Eldrazi processor for 3 and a blue. It has Devoid, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put a card an opponent owns from exile into that player's graveyard. If you do, return target creature to its owner's hand. Most sets these days have a card like this, a blue creature that bounces another when it enters play. But usually that bounce ability is automatic, whereas here you need to process a card to do it. Whilst it's not the harshest of setup costs, it's still one you need to keep in mind. It's not too uncommon to be in a scenario where you need to cast Merc Strider as your turn 4 play, but haven't yet exiled one of your opponent's cards. At that point, you're playing a 3/2 for 4 with no abilities, which isn't good at all. This card will probably work best in a deck with at least 4 or 5 early ways to exile your opponent's cards, because having this in your hand without any of your opponent's cards in exile is going to be an awful feeling. In that case, you'd probably want to pick up the cards that enable the process strategy before taking this one, because at least then you can use those cards to enable any of the processes. I don't think this is especially worth taking first, but could well be a better pick later in the pack, depending on how your draft goes. Voracious Null is a 2/2 zombie for 2 and a black. You can pay 1 and a black and sacrifice another creature to put 2 +1/+1 counters on itself at any time you could cast a sorcery. As a 2/2 for 3, you're not really getting a good deal for your mana. You can pump it permanently by sacrificing other creatures, but at that point you're losing good cards to make a not so good one better. And you can't even use it to sacrifice the targets of your opponent's removal spells, as it can only be done at sorcery speed. Overall, I don't think this is a terribly good card, and I won't be picking it first. Our next card is Inspired Charge, an instant for 2 white. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. This is the sort of spell you're going to want in a weenie deck, a deck filled with loads of small, cheap creatures. The more creatures you have in play when you cast this, the more you get out of it. Outside of that kind of deck, this spell isn't all that great. Unlike most other spells like this that have been printed recently, this is an instant, giving you the chance to surprise your opponent in the middle of your combat phase or even in theirs, so it's useful both when you're attacking and defending. This isn't a card you're going to want to take pack 1 pick 1, but rather you're going to want to pick this card a little later once you already know that you're in a deck that wants it. Volcanic Upheaval is an instant for 3 and a red. Destroy target land. Land destruction isn't usually a good strategy in Limited. Whilst there is a lot more interaction with lands in Battle for Zendikar, it's still not enough to make this a good card. It's a sideboard card at best, brought out of your sideboard if your opponent shows you 3 or more awaken spells and/or creature lands in your first game. In that case, you might even be able to get a 2-for-1 by destroying the sole target of an awaken spell, but that's probably not going to happen all too often. I'm not going to take this card first, and quite possibly not at all. Tajiru Beastmaster is a 5/5 elf warrior ally for 5 and a green. It has a rally ability, so whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. A 5/5 for 6 is a good body, and it brings a nice ability with it. Even if you don't have many other creatures that can attack on the turn you cast it, the body is big enough that it can help stabilize the board. You're probably going to want this at the top end of a deck with a good number of allies in it. And if you can cast 2 allies in a single turn afterwards, then your entire team will get a very nice bonus. Overall, this is a pretty nice card, though I probably wouldn't take it first because I'd prefer something cheaper or more powerful. Demon's Grasp is a sorcery for 4 and a black. Target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. As far as removal goes, this is powerful but not terribly efficient. 5 mana is about the going rate these days for unconditional removal, but there are going to be creatures around that this isn't going to kill outright. You do have the option of attacking your opponent with a smaller creature, and if they block it with their larger one, then you can play this in your second main phase to get rid of the larger creature. But that requires your opponent to actually block your creature. Not to mention that you're probably trading away your smaller creature unless it has a huge toughness. Overall, I feel that this is powerful removal with some minor downsides. I wouldn't be sad at all to take this first. Skyline Cascade is a land that enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. It also taps for a blue mana. Lands that have spell-like abilities when they enter play can be quite useful. In the early game, if you don't have a terribly aggressive deck, then they just act like a regular land. But in the late game, then they can give you an additional effect at almost no cost to you. In this case, you can freeze an already tapped creature for a turn. That's a useful ability, but it is limited by the fact that the creature has to already be tapped. To me, that implies that this card would be most useful in a racing scenario, where both players are trying to kill each other at the same time. It does have applications when you're behind, because for the cost of your land drop, you're stopping your opponent's biggest creature from attacking again, but it doesn't really give a great benefit if you're already winning. Overall, I think this is a nice card, but not an especially powerful one. You're not going to want to take it first, even though it's going to fit into a number of blue decks, simply because it's a land rather than a spell. Eldrazi Sky Spawner is a 2/1 Eldrazi drone for 2 and a blue. It has Devoid, Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield, which has Sacrifice this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. This is a pretty decent card. 3 power and 2 toughness for 3 mana, with 2 of that power being in the air and the other being a Scion token, is an incredible deal on a single card. You're never not going to want to cast this on turn 3. It's great when you're already winning. It gives you 2 blockers when you're behind, and if the board's snarled up with a bunch of ground creatures, then it gives you a good amount of power that can fly over them. It's good at every point in the game. Eldrazi Sky Spawner is probably the most powerful card in the pack so far, and probably the current frontrunner for first pick. Ruin Processor is a 7/8 Eldrazi processor for 7 colorless mana. When you cast it, then you can put a card an opponent owns from exile into that player's graveyard, and if you do so, then you gain 5 life. As a 7-drop, you're probably not going to put this card into your deck unless you have ways you can ramp into it. Without ramp, you're probably not going to be able to cast this until turn 9 or 10. As a finisher in a ramp deck, it's not bad. It's a decent enough body for the mana, and the chance to gain a hefty chunk of life is a nice bonus that can help you if you're racing your opponent. Overall, there are better cards to use as a finisher, but Ruin Processor will suffice if necessary. I wouldn't want to take it first though. Our first uncommon is Hagra Sharpshooter, a 2/2 human assassin ally for 2 and a black. You can pay 4 and a black to give target creature -1/-1 until end of turn. A 2/2 for 3 isn't a great deal, so you're relying on the ability to carry this card. Honestly, I don't think it's all that great. By the time you can afford to use the ability, your opponent probably has bigger cards on the table such that the -1/-1 penalty won't be too detrimental. You can certainly use it to pick off X1s, but that's a terribly inefficient use of your mana. And you probably won't be able to get to 10 mana to use it twice in a turn. Having said all of that, the threat of activation can be powerful. If your opponent knows you have it on board, then they might be more hesitant to attack if they know that you can mess with any creature's power and toughness. Overall, I don't think this is a great card, but it might go well in an ally deck as a way to use up extra mana later in the game. I'm quite certain that I won't be picking this first. Dampening Pulse is an enchantment for 3 and a blue. Creatures your opponents control get -1/-0. Dampening Pulse is an interesting card to evaluate because whilst it affects the board, its effects are hard to judge. Reducing all of your opponent's creatures' power by 1 will likely throw off the power level of most cards in their deck. It makes any kind of situation where those creatures block or get blocked more difficult for your opponent. I don't think that it's that useful on turn 4, as I'd rather have a creature, but I think it definitely pulls its weight in the other quadrants, especially when you're behind or at parity. Overall, I reckon this is a decent card, but I don't yet have a good enough feel as to quite how powerful it is. I'd like to try taking it, but perhaps not as a pack one pick one. Hedron Archive is an artifact for 4 colorless mana. You can tap it to add 2 to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 mana, tap it and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. I like Hedron Archive. Whilst it doesn't do anything to help your board position on turn 4, it does allow you to ramp to 7 mana on turn 5, which can be pretty backbreaking. And in the late game, once you don't need its ramp effect anymore, you can trade it in for 2 more cards. Being colorless also means that taking it pack one pick one means that you're staying open. Overall, I'd say that this is a pretty solid pack one pick one and could well be my pick. Today, our rare is a mythic rare. We've got Drana, Liberator of Malakir, a 2/3 legendary vampire ally for 1 black. It has flying, first strike, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. This is a very strong card. Taking it first means that you're committing yourself to black pretty hard, as to cast this on turn 3, you probably ought to be running at least 10 black mana sources in your deck. But if you can do that, then you force your opponent to answer the question, do you have an answer for this? Because if they don't, then they're probably going to lose the game in pretty short order. The fact that she has first strike works extremely well with her last ability, since it means that she'll pump up all of the attacking creatures before they deal their combat damage, assuming none of them have first strike or double strike. And the flying helps her to connect with your opponent to do so. Later in the game, she's okay, being a reasonably good blocker. If your opponent has no flyers, then she'll still cause problems for him. The fact that she's an ally will trigger rally abilities too. Overall, I feel that this is a very powerful card and almost certainly worth considering as the first pick here. We also have an island and a core ally token. Let's have a quick review of all the cards in today's pack. I feel that there are several first pick worthy cards in today's pack. Demon's Grasp, Eldrazi Skyspawner, and Hedron Archive are all solid cards that you wouldn't be sad to pick first. But I think that Drana, Liberator of Malakir, just blows all of those out of the water. If you cast her on turn 3, then you've got an extremely good chance of winning the game from that point, and she's still pretty good later in the game too. Drana, Liberator of Malakir, is my first pick. And that's about all we've got time for today. If you disagree with my choice, then please let me know in the comments below, on Facebook, or on Twitter. Have a good day now!